On the night of March 1, 1953, at the Kuncevo dacha, the atmosphere did not carry the scent of history, but the stench of biological failure. On the dining room floor, Joseph Stalin, the man who had transformed an entire continent into a construction site of fear, lay motionless in his own urine. A stroke had brought down the father of nations, turning him into an unconscious mass of flesh, wheezing and helpless. But the most terrifying entity in that room was not the dying man on the floor, but the one watching from the shadows of the corridor, Lavrentiy Beria. To understand Beria, one does not look at the medals on his uniform chest. Look instead at the fragile pince-nez perched on his smooth, oily face. Behind those lenses were not the eyes of a politician, but the eyeballs of a reptile, cold, unblinking, and always calculating the thermal energy of its prey. Beria did not see a mentor nearing death, he saw a power vacuum. For decades, Beria had existed as a perfect parasite in Stalin's shadow. He was the administrator of the NKVD, the gargantuan meat grinder that had crushed millions of souls. But the relationship between Beria and Stalin was never one of loyalty. It was a dance of survival between two apex predators. Stalin kept Beria close for his efficient brutality. Beria submitted to Stalin because he was the only host large enough to conceal his own distinct crimes. When the guards discovered Stalin and summoned the Politburo members, a psychological drama of sickening proportions unfolded. Observe Beria's actions. As the doctors approached Stalin's body with trembling hands, Beria stood there, majestic and threatening. When Stalin lapsed into a deep coma, Beria's eyes glowed with an irrepressible joy. He began shouting at the doctors, insulting his colleagues, and behaving as if the crown had already been placed upon his head. The reptilian instinct told him the host was dead, and it was now time for the parasite to take over the entire body. But then, a moment of horrifying contrast occurred. In a brief moment of consciousness, Stalin suddenly opened his eyes. He looked around the room with terror, his left arm rising as if to point at something or someone. Instantly, Beria's psychological machinery switched gears at the speed of light. The man who had been arrogant seconds before suddenly lunged toward the floor. He knelt by the bedside, seized Stalin's rough hand, and kissed it repeatedly. Tears streamed down his greasy cheeks. Laments of devotion and grief echoed through the room. This was not remorse. This was a reflex survival mechanism. Beria was checking to see if the great beast had truly fallen. But as soon as Stalin's eyes glazed over and his breathing became ragged, Beria snapped upright. The transformation was instantaneous. The face, contorted with suffering, returned to a cold, expressionless state like a plaster mask. Before his stunned comrades, such as Khrushchev and Malenkov, Beria walked out of the room, stopped at the door, and spat a mouthful of contemptuous saliva onto the floor. That act said everything. A single spit stripped bare the entire nature of a 30-year relationship. It was not just a release, but the ultimate insult to the man he had been forced to serve in trembling fear. Question for a psychological analyst at this point is, why would a man as sharp and cautious as Beria reveal his contempt so soon? The answer lies in pathological confidence. Beria believed he held the nucleus of power, the secret dossiers. In the drawers at the Lubyanka, Beria kept records of every sin, every careless word, every illicit affair of everyone standing in that room. He believed he was the only one who truly knew the mire of each individual, and therefore he was invulnerable. When Stalin drew his last breath at 9:50 p.m. on March 5, while others stood paralyzed by fear or feigning prayer, Beria was the first to bolt out of the villa door. He screamed for his limousine. The Viper had left the den. It no longer needed to pretend. In Beria's mind at that moment, the 170 million citizens of the Soviet Union and the entire Eastern Bloc were not human beings, but numbers on an abacus he had just gained the right to manipulate. He had prepared for this moment for a long time. While his comrades were fumbling with funeral rites, Beria had already begun sketching a plan to restructure the empire in a way no one could have expected. An apex hunter never stops to celebrate victory. It begins looking for its next prey. And at the Kremlin, the potential prey, his old comrades, were beginning to realize that as the old dictator lay down, something darker, more sophisticated, and more inhuman was preparing to swallow them all. The journey of 114 days of absolute power had begun. It was not a reign, but an autopsy where Beria was the surgeon, and the entire country was the patient on the operating table without anesthesia. But there was one thing Beria's reptilian instinct overlooked. A lone beast backed into a corner becomes terrifying, but a weak pack backed into a corner starts learning how to alliance to destroy the hunter. The fall of Lavrentiy Beria did not begin with a political mistake. It began with the very arrogance found in that spit at the Kuncevo dacha. He had forgotten that, in the shadows of a totalitarian system, the one who knows too much is also the first who must die. In the history of political phantoms, there has never been a transformation more bizarre and loathsome than the final 114 days of Lavrentiy Beria. Imagine a vulture suddenly picking its own rotting flesh clean in an attempt to sprout the wings of a dove. This was not repentance, it was a tactical molting. As soon as the ashes of Stalin's body had barely cooled within the Kremlin walls, Beria executed a spectacular pounce toward the center of power. He merged the Ministry of State Security, MGB, with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MVD, transforming himself into the absolute master of every dungeon, every secret agent, and every dark dossier across 1/6 of the world's surface. But instead of tightening the iron grip as expected, the viper began to loosen. Within weeks, Beria unleashed a series of decrees that shook the foundations of the totalitarian system he himself had painstakingly built. He ordered the release of over 1 million prisoners from the Gulag camps. He suspended the Doctor's Plot, an anti-Semitic purge initiated by Stalin. He banned the use of torture in interrogations at the Lubyanka prison. To anatomize Beria's psyche during this period, we must discard all concepts of benevolence. Beria did not become a democrat. He was conducting a purification by fire to protect himself. By publicly condemning the errors of the Stalinist era, Beria was subtly sending a toxic message to his comrades in the Politburo. He seemed to say, "You see, I have evidence that we are all murderers, but if I am the one who steps forward to correct the wrongs, then I will be the hero, while you will forever remain the stains of the past." The detail that says it all lay in the leather briefcase that was glued to Beria's side in every meeting. Inside were not economic plans, but carefully selected dossiers. Sitting across from Khrushchev or Malenkov, Beria would habitually adjust his pince-nez, piercing his opponent with murky eyes and smiling, a smile that never reached his eyes. He would occasionally mention a small detail, a location, or a name from the dark years of 1937. It was a sophisticated form of psychological torture. Beria was telling them that his armor was woven from their own sins. He believed that as long as he held the fear of others, he would be immortal. The contrast here reached the extreme of absurdity. The man who had signed the orders for the massacre of tens of thousands of Polish officers at Katyn, the man who had turned the kidnapping of young girls on the streets of Moscow into a pathological pastime, was now playing the role of protector of civil rights. This irony did not fill Beria with self-loathing. On the contrary, it exhilarated him. Beria enjoyed the sensation of manipulating reality, the feeling of being able to turn black into white with a single stroke of red ink. However, the Viper made a fatal error in its calculations, the underestimation of desperation. In Beria's world, everyone was a pawn controlled by fear, but he forgot that when fear becomes too great, it transforms into a collective survival instinct. Khrushchev, Malenkov, and especially the military generals under Marshal Zhukov did not see a reformer. They saw a man dismantling the walls of their common house to build a private fortress for himself. They saw a man who knew too much and was preparing to use that knowledge to tighten a noose around all their necks. During the White Nights in Moscow, while Beria smugly reviewed reports of public support for his new policies, in the shadows of discreet apartments, his comrades began to whisper. They began to realize that there was only one way to escape the ghost of Beria: destroy the keeper of the secrets. The more absolute power he held, the more isolated Beria became in his arrogance. He began making bold foreign policy decisions, even proposing to sell East Germany in exchange for economic support from the West. This was a step too far. It was no longer an internal power play. It was a threat to the survival of the entire socialist system that the others were trying to preserve. Beria's 114 days were like a slow-motion film of an explosion. At the epicenter was a man in pince-nez, believing himself to be the architect of the future, but at the edge of the blast, fragments of the past were flying back. Every prisoner released from the Gulag was a reminder of Beria's crimes. Every dossier he pulled out to threaten a colleague was a reason for them to open fire. The Viper believed it was constricting its prey, but in reality, it was entangling itself in a trap from which it could not escape. Beria had forgotten the golden rule of the very system he created. In a room full of killers, the one who shouts that he has changed is the one who will be killed first. In June 1953, the heat of the Moscow summer became stifling. The air in the Kremlin grew thick, as if a storm were about to break. Beria still walked the long corridors with the confidence of a lord, completely unaware that the rats he had long despised had begun to sharpen their teeth. The play of the reformer was about to close, and the final chapter would not be written in ink, but in blood and pathetic screams in a military bunker. The Kremlin in the months following Stalin's death was not a center of national administration, but a labyrinth of men driven into a corner. Look at the men sitting around the heavy oak table during Politburo sessions. Nikita Khrushchev with his crude, clumsy appearance, Georgy Malenkov with his round, pallid face, and Vyacheslav Molotov with the weary eyes of a man who had survived one too many purges. In Beria's eyes, these men were merely timid mice. He looked at them through his pince-nez with a contempt he hardly bothered to conceal. For a psychological analyst, Beria's arrogance at this point had reached a pathological threshold. He believed he held the nucleus of fear for every individual. He knew who had wept and pleaded with Stalin during late-night drinking bouts, who had signed death warrants for their own kin, and who harbored treasonous plots in their minds. The detail that says it all during this period was the black leather briefcase Beria always carried. He would often place it on the meeting table slowly, the dry click of the latch echoing in the dead silence. It was a symbolic act. The briefcase did not contain administrative papers, it contained fates. When Beria flipped open a file, he wasn't just reading information, he was stroking the noose tightening around his colleagues' necks. But this was precisely where the viper's instinct betrayed him. Beria was so focused on the power of fear that he forgot a fundamental psychological law. When fear exceeds a certain threshold, it neutralizes cowardice and triggers an extreme instinct for self-defense. The timid mice he despised began to realize a grim truth. If they did not eat Beria alive, Beria would surely devour them. The contrast here is intensely dramatic. On one side was Beria, confident in his artificial omnipotence, constantly introducing shocking reforms and veiled threats. On the other was a loose but desperate alliance forming in the shadows. Khrushchev, whom Beria often dismissed as a stupid peasant, suddenly became the architect of a silent coup. During long walks on deserted paths or in apartments meticulously swept for NKVD listening devices, Khrushchev began connecting the pieces. He understood that to take down a man who controlled the entire secret police system, they needed a force outside Beria's reach, the military. And the man who held the military at that time was none other than Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of World War II, who harbored a deep-seated hatred for Beria. Let us analyze the error in Beria's calculation. He believed he could manipulate Zhukov with secret dossiers, just as he had done with the politicians. But Zhukov was a different entity, a soldier of brutal action who feared ghosts in a drawer far less than he feared the loss of honor and country. When Khrushchev approached Zhukov, a survival pact was signed with nods in the darkness. A rhetorical question arises. Why did Beria, with an intelligence network covering every corner, not know of this conspiracy? The answer lies in the blindness of absolute power. Beria had become so accustomed to people trembling before him that he mistook their silence for submission rather than preparation for a retaliatory strike. He believed the mice would forever be mice. He did not expect that, when backed into a corner, a pack of mice could bring down a viper. The feast of the timid mice was nearing its end. The glasses of vodka on the Politburo table no longer carried the stinging heat of intoxication, but the bitter taste of impending betrayal. Beria sat there, adjusting his pince-nez, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed he was the only sober person in a room full of madmen. He did not know that, behind the grand doors of the Kremlin, Zhukov's soldiers had begun to chamber their rounds. The noose Beria had prepared for his comrades was being secretly slipped back over his own neck. The viper's complacency had turned it into a stationary target, and in the world of ultimate power, he who does not move is crushed. June 26, 1953. Moscow sweltered under the summer sun, but inside the meeting room of the Council of Ministers at the Kremlin, the temperature seemed to drop below zero. This was not a political session, it was a ritualistic execution, where the spine of the viper would be snapped in its own lair. Observe Lavrentiy Beria as he entered the room. He maintained the air of a superior, the leather briefcase filled with the sins of the world tucked tightly under his arm. He sat down and adjusted his pince-nez with a leisurely defiance. To Beria, this was just another day to manipulate the mice trembling around the table. He had no idea that beneath the coats of everyone in the room, except his own, lay a loaded pistol. The contrast here was brutal, diabolical intellect versus raw power. Khrushchev was the one to open fire, not with a gun but with words. He began listing Beria's crimes: traitor, usurper, sexual deviant, and British imperialist spy. Imagine Beria's face at that moment. Instead of fear, his first reaction was a contemptuous smirk. He reached for his briefcase, his only weapon, the black dossiers. He believed that by pulling out a single sheet of paper, he could silence Khrushchev forever. But the game had changed. The rules of the dossier no longer held value when the opposition had decided to abandon the political playbook and return to the instincts of a wild beast. As Beria attempted to speak in rebuttal, Malenkov, sitting in the chairman's seat with trembling hands, pressed a secret button. That was the signal. The doors to the meeting room burst open. The appearance of Marshal Georgy Zhukov was an electric shock to Beria's reality. Zhukov did not come alone. He was accompanied by a group of high-ranking generals, real soldiers with war scars, men who considered death a part of their daily routine. "Hands up," Zhukov barked. His voice carried none of the hesitation of a politician. It was the command of a conqueror. The detail that says it all lies in this exact moment. Beria's pince-nez fell to the floor. In this world of madness, those glasses were the symbol of Beria's intellectual power and control. When they fell, his world turned into a blur. The man who had once controlled millions of lives was now forced to his knees, groping for shards of glass on the floor while the brutal hands of soldiers seized his collar. The viper had been hoisted off the ground, its fangs useless without a foothold. Beria began to babble, not the sharp words of a chief architect, but broken whimpers. "Nikita, what is this? Georgy, what are you doing?" A rhetorical question for us: what is more painful for a tyrant? Physical death, or the collapse of the illusion of invulnerability? Looking into Beria's eyes then, eyeballs bulging behind the missing lenses, one did not see a political rival. One saw a terrified animal. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by the lowliest survival instinct. He was disarmed, stripped of honor, and most importantly, stripped of the fear he used to rule. As Beria looked around the table, he no longer saw timid mice. He saw executioners looking back at him with hatred accumulated over decades. This arrest was an oncological surgery performed without anesthesia. Beria was shoved out of the meeting room, not through the main entrance reserved for heads of state, but through a side passage, and thrown into the back of a canvas-covered military truck. The Kremlin Viper had been caged. The machine he had spent a lifetime perfecting now began to turn its gears to crush him. Ironically, the warrant for his arrest and imprisonment was not based on any legal process he had ever preached. It was based on the very absurdity and brutality he had sown. Beria was taken to a secret military bunker deep beneath the Moscow soil. There, in darkness and isolation, the Lord of Fear would have to learn to taste the flavor he had served to millions of others, the wait for death. Lavrentiy Beria was not imprisoned at the Lubyanka. His captors understood all too well that in that place, every brick and every guard carried the breath of Beria. Bringing him to the Lubyanka would have been akin to returning a viper to its own den. Instead, they threw him into an underground room at the Moscow military district headquarters, a cold concrete bunker deep beneath the earth, where the only light came from a dangling incandescent bulb emitting a sickly, pale yellow glow. Here we witnessed the final autopsy, the disintegration of an ego. Observe Beria during his days of captivity. No longer in his crisp uniform, no longer wearing his pince-nez, which the soldiers had deliberately crushed upon his arrest. Deprived of his sharp vision, Beria's world became an opaque blur. He sat huddled on a narrow iron bed, his murky eyes groping through the air. The detail that says it all lay in his hands. The hands that once signed orders to kill millions were now trembling uncontrollably, repeatedly clawing at the oily flesh of his face. The reptilian instinct had now shifted entirely into a state of panic. Realizing that his manipulative tactics no longer worked on the stone-faced guards, Beria began one final desperate campaign: letters from the abyss. He wrote to Malenkov, he wrote to Khrushchev, using words that, if read a year prior, would have been mistaken for a cruel joke. "Dear comrades, please forgive an old soldier who has made mistakes. I kneel at your feet. Do not kill me, I still have value." The contrast here is an insult to history. A man who treated brutality as an art form, who mocked victims begging for mercy in torture chambers, was now using the most abject language to beg for his life. This was the total collapse of his so-called superior intellect. Stripped of power, Beria was nothing left but a shivering mass of flesh, pathetically clinging to existence. On December 23, 1953, the secret trial began. It was not a trial in the conventional legal sense. It was the reading of a verdict for an entity already excised from the human community. Beria stood there, hair disheveled, clothes in disarray, listening to the list of crimes he had once considered his pride, the Katyn massacre, the ethnic cleansings, and the endless list of women he had violated. A rhetorical question: does a monster feel remorse when looking back at what it has done? The answer is no. Looking at Beria's expression at the trial, one saw no repentance. One only saw the fury of a hunter who suddenly realized he had become the prey. He did not regret his crimes, he regretted getting caught. After the death sentence was pronounced, Beria was immediately taken down to the execution cellar. Here, the drama reached the pinnacle of disgust. At the sight of the gallows and the officers holding guns, Beria completely collapsed. He did not walk like a man preparing to face his fate. He slumped down, clutching the officers' boots, wailing so piteously that even the most battle-hardened soldiers felt nauseated. The final detail, the one that stripped bare the total meanness of the tyrant, the gag. Because Beria's screams were so piercing and disrupted the execution protocol, Marshal Zhukov ordered a rag to be stuffed into his mouth. A deathly silence filled the cellar. The Lord of Fear, whose voice could once make a continent tremble, died in stifled silence with a rag in his mouth. General Pavel Batitsky, tasked with carrying out the justice, drew his pistol. He looked into the eyes bulging with terror behind Beria's wrinkled facial skin and pulled the trigger, a single shot to the center of the forehead. Beria's body was cremated immediately, his ashes scattered in an unidentified location in the Moscow woods. No grave, no monument, no trace left behind. Justice in this instance operated like a cold and precise machine, exactly as Beria had designed it. It needed no emotion, it needed no tolerance. It simply removed a component that was broken and threatened the operation of the entire system. The fall of Lavrentiy Beria is the ultimate testament to a dark truth. Those who live by fear will die in the very fear they created. The viper bit its own tail, and its venom completed the final task of destroying its master. The Kremlin still stands, but the ghost of Beria has been swept into the dust of history, leaving behind a lesson on brutality and the inevitable downfall of those who consider themselves lords over the blood and bones of their fellow men.